So in yesterday's video, I was talking about um, if we pay attention to our thinking more, if we become more aware of our thinking, which we can do in so many different ways. We can utilize stillness, meditation. We can do something like the 7-day mental diet. There's so many different ways to become more aware of our thinking. Mindfulness in general just means, I would say becoming more aware of what's happening in the present moment, more aware of what we're thinking, what we're imagining, right? And for practical purposes, thinking is synonymous with imagining. And, when we use the word imagining in regards to manifesting stuff, we think about it in this very grandiose way, in this Neville-esque way. But really, it's just thinking how we're thinking, right? And being kind of aware of our thinking and the direction of our thinking. And, I was saying yesterday that what we find ourselves thinking automatically, like what we're just thinking, is what we're auto-suggesting to ourselves. That's what we're auto-suggesting to ourselves, our automatic thought patterns. And we have a tendency, obviously, to buy into what we're automatically thinking and not question it. And if we pay attention to our thinking in the ways that, I just mentioned, or in other ways, just becoming more mindful of our thoughts, we will probably notice that the thoughts we're thinking throughout the day, a lot of them, and again, we have thousands and thousands and thousands of thoughts each day, we'll notice the overall pattern of our thinking is often much more negative than we would like. And that what we're thinking, or you could say auto-suggesting to ourselves, and what we in turn accept as being true, is more negative, or one could say pessimistic, than it needs to be. In other words, what we're thinking or imagining all day long is more negative, more lackful, more hurtful, more shameful than it needs to be. As Earl Nightingale said, we become what we think all day long. I think Emerson said that too. That's a famous quote, understandably. That's what they meant, is that what you're thinking, imagining, auto-suggesting to yourself and accepting, it becomes your reality in some significant way. And we notice through doing this, inner work, that a lot of the stuff we're imagining, thinking, auto-suggesting to ourselves is incredibly negative. And this might make us feel, it's going to make many emotions come up perhaps, but one of the emotions that will come up, a big one, is shame. And this is, when people talk about doing shadow work, this is it, folks. This is real, you could say, inner work or manifesting work, is looking at your shadow, looking at how you feel. It's great when we have positive thoughts and we accept them and everything's wonderful and we feel the wish fulfilled, or whatever you want to call it. But noticing how much negative imaginings, how much negative thinking, how much negative auto-suggesting you're doing throughout the day, and then working with that and relieving yourself of some of that shame, is a far more practical and realistic approach to this stuff a lot of the time, in my opinion. So today I thought I would read a little bit from Robert Augustus Masters' book, Bringing Your Shadow Out of the Dark. Bringing Your Shadow Out of the Dark. I'll put a link in the description. We've mentioned Masters quite a few times on this channel. 2 fantastic books that he's written that we've talked about previously are Spiritual Bypassing and Emotional Intimacy. This book, Bringing Your Shadow Out of the Dark, is more recent. I think more popular, too. Pretty popular book when it came out a few years ago, if I remember correctly. Just reading about it recently, it seems like it's more popular. Anyway, Masters is really a master at working with these difficult emotions and working with these imaginings and thinkings and auto-suggestions that come up that we accept that are overly negative and that make us feel bad, make us feel ashamed a lot of the time. He writes in this book, shame is the painfully self-conscious sense of our actions or actual self being exposed as bad, screwed up, or otherwise defective. Not surprisingly, shame is frequently viewed as something negative or something that simply obstructs us. But shame itself isn't necessarily negative or an impediment to our growth. What matters is how we relate to it, how we use it. Very interesting. How we relate to it, how we use it. I might add how we react to it. Master says, there's such a thing as healthy shame. Such shame, which is directed at our behavior, catalyzes our conscious. In stark contrast, unhealthy shame, which is directed at our being, catalyzes our inner critic, which commonly masquerades as our conscience. Healthy shame helps empower us to take life-giving action, such as saying we're sorry from our heart and making amends. But unhealthy shame, toxic shame, disempowers us, leaving us contracted and busy beating ourselves up. In healthy shame, there is no aggression, but in unhealthy shame, there is. This is why, like a couple of weeks ago, we were talking about the mental diet. We were talking about creating that gap and being less reactive towards our behavior. That's exactly what doing something like a mental diet can do for you, is it will allow you not to react to your thinking in the same way. So instead of beating yourself up, you'll take appropriate, life-giving, loving action instead of beating yourself up for these negative self-suggestions. In, that kind of response where you are taking life-giving action, as Master says, such as saying we're sorry to somebody from our heart, or sorry to ourselves from our heart, and making amends, forgiving people, forgiving ourselves. In that kind of shame, there's no aggression. There's no self-sabotage. In unhealthy shame, there is. Masters goes on to say, unfortunately, most shame is far from healthy, humiliating rather than humbling us, degrading us for not making the grade. In its mortifying grip, we don't just lose face, but also heart. When shame arises in us, we typically want to get away from it as quickly as we can. It's as if we're suddenly naked upon a brightly lit stage before a critical audience with no curtain to shield us. Regardless of how brief that exposure may be, it can register with devastating impact, shrink-wrapping us with self-loathing. No wonder we want to dim the lights, hide our face, cover up, and relocate our shame to a darker place. Shame, for better or for worse, empathetically deflates us, cutting us down to size. It's the emotional hub of not looking good, not looking together, not looking competent. And who wants to put this on display? So, when we notice our thinking, when we become more aware, which is a big word in the LOA community, Neville said the power of awareness. When we become more truly aware of our thinking, of what we're suggesting to ourselves throughout the day, and what we tend to accept as being true, we will notice this. We'll notice the shame we have a lot of the time. And the question is, are we going to be willing to work with this shame in a loving way and give it life-giving action, or are we going to beat ourselves up for having all these shameful thoughts? And the shameful thoughts, along with the shameful thoughts will come feelings, shameful feelings, feelings of hurt. Masters goes on to write here, if we manage to push our shame far enough into our shadow, we may even forget it's there, even as we compensate for the effect it has had on us. as when we inflate ourselves through narcissism, excessive pride, or supercompetency. Probably the most common way shame makes its presence known from within our shadow is when it catalyzes aggression or emotional withdrawal in us. Once we're busy being aggressive towards others or ourselves, or being emotionally distant or numb, it may seem that this is all we're feeling. But the reality may be that our primary emotion at such times is shame, however hidden it may be. This is deep stuff. This ties directly into, like what I was talking to Melissa Basie last week about attachment theory and shame. This rears its head a lot in relationships, especially people who have trouble in intimate relationships. A lot of people with SP issues. And it ties into, we're going to have that free class/group session next Tuesday, May 30th at 4 p.m. Kind of exploring some of these issues, which is one reason that I'm going over this excerpt now that Masters is writing. This is the inner work, the kind of energetic, emotional healing work we want to do if we want to rectify a lot of these issues we have in our lives regarding our relationship with ourselves and also our relationship with others, like romantic relationships, SP relationships. Masters goes on to write, he gives an example from his own life of what this all looks like. He says, when I was 8 or 9, I proudly brought home my report card. It was packed with A's. I showed it to my father, and without looking at me, he muttered something about, what the hell good is this when you can't even screw in a bolt straight? I slouched beneath the crushing shame I felt at hearing these words. I'd already learned that if I couldn't master a skill such as screwing in a bolt straight right away, he wouldn't give me a second chance. The lesson which he drove into me over and over was that being successful meant being competent in skills that he valued. And being incompetent in such skills meant being rejected, hurt, blasted with shame. And the more shame I felt, the more I was pulled to be aggressive with others, especially with regard to besting them physically and academically. I had zero awareness of this connection between shame and aggression at the time. It was completely hidden in my shadow. So it often happens in narcissism too, in extreme cases as well. And, he wrote earlier too, excessive pride or supercompetency in a field often is, the origins are something like this. And this doesn't matter if you're male or female. Maggie did a great video the other day. I'll link to it above. It's an epic video. She said it was one of the more important videos that she's ever done, talking about this, about childhood trauma. This is trauma, what we're talking about here. Like what Masters has described as a traumatic event. Childhood trauma affecting our behavior for the rest of our lives. And affecting it negatively, and affecting what we're suggesting and thinking to ourselves negatively for decades and decades, unless we become more aware of it and work with it. Masters writes here that the shift from shame to aggression, shame becoming background, aggression moving to the foreground, can happen in a split second. And it happens because of traumatic events like this, which often happen in our childhood. He says, such as when we feel shame during a disagreement with another and immediately go on the offensive. That's an example of like the shame, instead of, having the shame out there, immediately masking it with aggression. But really it's shame is the underlying feeling, emotion. In narcissism, he goes on, he writes later, if we grew up with a load of shame and shaming, the fantasy of being in positions where we can't be shamed might understandably be immensely appealing. That's often why we see narcissism. Narcissism is all about being in and maintaining such an unassailable position, allowing in only those who unquestionably support us. What's in our shadow here is shame, empathy, vulnerability, and grief. Later on, this again ties in with attachment theory and some of the stuff that we're going to be exploring probably in the group session next week. And working with it is, and this ties in so much to SP stuff. This is just real SP talk here, basically. Master says later on in this chapter, we may unquestionably believe that we're unworthy, especially when our relationships go awry. And we may also keep our attachment to this belief out of sight, that we're unworthy. What we're auto-suggesting to ourselves constantly in regards to this subject is that we're unworthy, and we're accepting it. And we're constantly perhaps auto-suggesting we're unworthy, but we're not aware that we're auto-suggesting this to ourselves and accepting it so regularly. So we may think we're okay if we're just like glossing around the surface of this stuff, but the reality is what we're actually suggesting to ourselves habitually is unworthiness. Master says, not addressing this attachment keeps us disempowered, small, stuck. We're then just like a child facing shame-infused parenting. We find a certain security in going along with the assertion that we're unworthy. Devaluing ourselves becomes a survival strategy. So, this is very different to narcissism. I mentioned narcissism because we see it a lot in the SP community and people being in relationships with narcissists. It happens a lot because a lot of people with SP issues have devalued themselves as a survival strategy. Master says one of the first steps in healing this dynamic is to bring its origins out of our shadow and get in between our inner child and our inner critic, identifying with neither while loving and protecting the child in us. Again, this is the inner work, the healing work of working with your inner child, that part of you. We neither lose ourselves in our shame nor flee it. We're present to it, holding it with a well-grounded awareness. See, this is awareness, but just not quite in the way that Neville evokes, one might say, or that a lot of these LOA teachers evoke. Masters concludes this chapter, which is called, by the way, this is chapter 7 in this book. It's called Our Shame, from Bringing Your Shadow Out of the Dark. He says, staying present with our shame rather than deporting it to our shadow does far more good than letting it morph into aggression and emotional disconnection. Being present with our shame, sitting in its fire with both dignity and humility, refines the warrior in us, male or female, and deepens our capacity for compassion, vulnerability, and relational sanity and joy. Bringing our shame, all of our shame, out of our shadow is a great gift for one and all. For in so doing, we keep ourselves empathetic and accountable and available for whatever healing or redirection is needed. Last week when I was talking about being serious about this manifesting stuff, this is what I meant. This is the inner work. This is why I like this stuff, this manifesting stuff, and relating it to things like therapy and counseling and self-improvement, emotional healing. This is why I like working with clients, is because this is the deep work. This is what it's all about. I hope you join us for that class next week if you're interested in this stuff. And for coaching or for help on any of these subjects, I can be reached at info@radicalcounselor.com. Until next time.